Okay, so welcome, Carrie. It's been a real pleasure to engage with your work. This piece is super smart, and you know, I think early on in the pandemic, many of us were wondering, you know, why is it these food production facilities are seeing an outbreak? And you know, early on there was speculation, you know, maybe chicken or pigs are carriers of the virus. You might notice that I put a science article on the deck for this week too, and if anything, I was just putting it there to show like, no, in fact, it's not because of you know, these other organisms that are sharing space with people. It's kind of the features of the industrial factory, and this is what you show so well with these histories of racial capitalism, the organized abandon that David Harvey characterizes. But really, you know, it seems like some of the key things you're getting at here is how these factories are stealing time and stealing lives. So for those of you who are just joining for the first time this week, feel free to ask a question by just putting it in the chat or unmute yourself. So Carrie, if you wanted to just take a minute to situate this piece within your broader work, like clearly you've done some really interesting and difficult field work. I mean, we just kind of got a glimpse of what you were actually doing in the factory. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the broader project and where this piece is situated in your other work.
Yeah, so this was, I guess, a piece that Brett Clark invited me to participate in, this special issue of Monthly Review. And if you haven't had a chance to read the other articles, I strongly suggest it. There's some really, really brilliant work in this special issue. But this, you know, this piece was going to look quite different. I was really wanting to focus on sort of explicating the plantation logic within the growth of the industry. And plantation logic is a term I use from Clyde Wood's work in the Delta. But then the world changed pretty drastically at the end of March, and many people were, I think, talking about this sort of correlation of hotspots, right, within meat processing plants and prisons. And I thought, well, this is an important time to really draw out some of the relationalities between these two sites, particularly their place in the US South, right? But it's part of a larger project that was mostly an ethnographic project of one of the state's largest poultry plants in Georgia. That took place from 2014 to 2016. So I was there. I spent, many people are excited about the ethnography within the plant. So I worked in a plant for 6 times, but all the women I worked with joked and called that my little time at the poultry. So it was a really chump change in the scheme of things. And in addition to that workplace ethnography, I conducted many multi-generational oral histories with women and their families who were connected to the plant. So either those who were currently working in the plant or who had been pushed out. And this is due to many other things outside of the plant. So what I'm doing in this larger project, which will eventually be a book, is really trying to use the poultry industry as a lens to think about racial capitalism and its regional manifestations in Georgia, and how this is so dependent on so many other things outside of the plant, right? So people's access to housing, histories of environmental degradation and expropriation of land and dispossession. I mean, even in this article, you can see some of the legacies of that, and trying to trace the current movements to Reconstruction and abolition, right? So it's a fairly big project, but the focus is through this industry and through the lens of poultry. But you know, as y'all know, at the end of March, these places were viewed as hotspots, right? But we had in our country, the first death of a prisoner was in Albany, Georgia, in Lee State Prison, right? Which was only about a half an hour from one of the plants where 3 workers died. Some of the first deaths within a Tyson plant there in Camilla, Georgia. In Kathleen, Georgia. And then there was also a major walkout where 50 workers walked off the line of a poultry plant nearby. And so these were all sort of instances, I think, of both worker resistance and rebellion, but also we can see the like drastic sort of forms of racism that shape premature death within both of these places. So I really wanted to think about those two connections within this article. And, you know, at the same time, and I'll try to wrap this up, but at the same time, you know, the Trump administration was working very closely with the USDA and some of the major representatives of the meat and poultry industries to not only enforce the Defense Production Act to keep the plants open and running, but even attempted and allowed line speed waivers to increase the rate of production at the same time. So we see these like intense contradictions happening within the poultry plant, right? That really just doesn't make sense from a human rights perspective, from a worker organizing perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a public health perspective, right? So grappling with all these contradictions inside the paper and trying to address that through this framework it was like a very big task. I'm not sure I completely accomplished it, but that was the goal. Yeah.
And one of the things I also really like about the piece is, you know, at the same time you're sort of situating this plant in the context of histories of dispossession and the prison industrial complex. You're accounting for utopian dreamings. Free the land was one of the phrases that kind of stood out from this place. So I would just love to hear more about, you know, dreams of living otherwise that are kind of getting squashed by this unrelenting speed. Incidentally, we have another expert on time here. Fan Yang has written some remarkable stuff about speed in Shenzhen, China, a very different historical context and cultural location. But yeah, I was just, you know, curious about these utopian imaginaries.
Yeah. So yeah, I was thinking quite a lot about like the mismatch in my own understandings of work at the plant and the understandings of that work by Black women who I worked alongside of, and how they really viewed like what the plant was doing and how it was extracting their labor and really harming their bodies in a very different way than how I had been disciplined and how I was entering the plant. But I think in those like very specific ethnographic instances, I was also trying to think alongside of Cedric Robinson's work and his argument about what he calls a shared consciousness, which is how he thinks about Black radicalism and the Black radical tradition. And this is he calls it a negation of Western civilization that is, you know, rooted in European domination of other people and places and natures, right? That we can see being reproduced through the dualities of racial capitalism and settler colonialism around the globe. And so like doing this sort of deep time sort of connection across the rise and growth of Western civilization to this plant was a kind of fun project. But, you know, I think what's really fascinating to me is thinking about forms of resistance that have been, make up or constitute the history of Black radicalism in our country and how those are rooted really in the US South. And I go all the way back to Du Bois's work on Black Reconstruction to think about the project of abolition democracy. And really this was a moment after emancipation, after the general strike, in which enslaved people like really fought for their own emancipation, where there was a world change moment in our country to really do things differently. And there was a vision rooted in the Freedmen's Bureau and attempts at what Du Bois calls Black Reconstruction as this great human experiment to reorganize the world, to reorganize and rethink our relationships to each other and to the earth and to production, right, in essence. And so during Reconstruction, and this is, there was a real contestation over land and what to do with it and on it and how to collectivize it or not. And so when I think about the long struggle for abolition, you know, that is probably many of you are thinking about today, particularly in regards to prison abolition and the movement for Black lives. I think it's actually, the longer history is quite visionary and expansive, and is rooted in a shared consciousness that that I think we could learn quite a bit from, and you know, is really about a reorganization of time and space.
And I think it's worth noting, like the foundational, you know, the 40 acres and the mule that was never granted, like it was a matter of public policy that was never enacted. So in some ways, like the freedom dreams aren't that radical. They're just sort of a reneged promise that the state made and then failed to follow through on.
Yeah, it's quite, I mean, fascinating when we think about the neoliberal project and the kinds of like anti-state state that Ruth Wilson Gilmore refers to in her work, right? And so these struggles for abolition are really about creating, I think, a different kind of state that cares for and supports its population, right? But you know, this sort of rollback or anti-state state, I think predates that 1970s period, and we can see struggles over the future of the state, like really rooted in Southern politics and what Clyde Woods calls the plantation bloc. And those models are really, I feel like, exported across the rest, or to the rest of the country, and now globally, and really emerged in the South. At least that's my argument.
You mentioned resistance a few moments ago, and there's a couple of moments where that comes up in the essay. One is where Nikki is coming along and offering you some advice, like, you know, you don't draw the birds. I guess drawing is just a way of cutting. Don't draw the birds so nice every time. It's just when the inspectors come around. And you also talk about in the COVID moment how people are staying home and just saying, you know, my life and my son's life is more important than some chicken. So do you see more acts of resistance ongoing now in the time of COVID, and sort of how have things changed since you wrote this piece?
Yeah, and what really has helped me to think about Nikki's actions as an act of resistance is really connected to some of, I mean, Clyde Woods' work, and, you know, the blues epistemology, thinking about the kinds of everyday acts that are really, like, really expand out from that individual moment. I'm also thinking of Psyche Williams-Forson's work on chicken and Black women's control of gaining of economic independence and power in the post-emancipation South. And finally, I'll add Du Bois's work in Souls and his chapter, especially on the Golden Fleece, which I think is really fascinating, right? And thinking about these forms of resistance that are much larger than about labor, about the conditions of labor, about the conditions of work, but are broader critiques, I think, of the way of organizing the world. But I think, you know, the walkouts that were that happened across the South and across several plants in the Midwest, meat packing plants in the Midwest, I think were really inspirational to the other kinds of resistance that was happening in other industries. But here, you know, we can think about resistance in relation to the extreme forms of domination I mentioned earlier with the state and the current administration's response to those kinds of resistance, right? But I think, you know, there are also many, and this is the point of thinking about the relationality of these two places, is also thinking about the unique forms of coalitions that are emerging in this moment. And so, you know, in response to the outbreaks across many plants, the UFCW, which is the major meatpacking and food processing union, led the way in bringing together a coalition of over 100 organizations to really push back against this DPA Act. They're also included in the coalition, right, are several immigrant rights organizations, racial justice organizations, environmental organizations. I think that it really provides like a very clear opening for the kinds of coalitions that are not only beginning to emerge through abolitionist movements, but that have always sort of worked together and across these different lines. But, you know, I think that here in Washington State, there are a few organizations working around that Tyson plant in Pasco, Washington. And it's only, that plant is really, really close to one of the state's prisons, Walla Walla. And so there are these really exciting coalitions emerging across those two groups, like environmental justice groups, farm worker organizations, and prison abolitionists here in the state. And so, yeah, I think that there are these small forms of everyday sort of acts of resistance that are occurring in James Scott's words, right? But also these are being broadened or scaling up in the current moment. Yeah.
So in thinking about, you know, with David Harvey about these histories of organized abandonment, you know, you've got the worker struggles on one hand, and then these strategies to undermine collective struggle with new waves of workers. And, you know, now we're in this moment where there's all the rhetoric about the wall and excluding Mexico. And it seems like on the other hand, like in plants like this, there's kind of a premium being placed on these precarious, undocumented laborers. Like, how is that playing out in the current moment as sort of the xenophobic rhetoric of the Trump White House is ratcheting up into high speed? Like, is there still kind of this dependence on that sort of criminality of these employers who are kind of basically using the precarious labor to perpetuate like this system?
Yeah, I think your question makes me think of the carceral, like how Ruth Wilson Gilmore and others are thinking about carceral geographies. And this is something that I really try to bring out in my work, is the connections between the different forms of criminalization that have occurred in our country. And so many people, you know, outside of the industry think of poultry processing as being an industry primarily dependent on undocumented Latinx workers. And historically, that has been true. I mean, if you check out Angela Stussey's work, Vanessa Rebus's work, there are several scholars who document this transformation of the industry that's really rooted in exactly your question, right? The deportability of an entire group of people, which enables this really crappy work conditions and poor pay and all sorts of other forms of labor exploitation. And I think there are important regional differences in what this looks like today across the industry. So, you know, as I mentioned in my field site, in my work, that plant had returned to a majority Black women workforce. In other parts of, like the New York Times piece on the workers who died in the Tyson plant down in South Georgia, most of those workers are Black women coming from a neighboring county. But yeah, you know, here in Washington, it looks very different. So I think there are those regional differences based on all sorts of histories of state level immigration law that have restructured the industry and what it looks and what the workforce might look like. But I think they're relational, right? And deportability works hand in hand and has been mobilized at different times to enable precarity within the workforce, while at the same time, you know, Black workers who have returned to the plants are not supported and are there because of often there because of a longer tie with the criminal injustice system, I would say. And, you know, I think here in at least like thinking comparatively and about the different forms of immigration control and deportation that have occurred across different spaces, right? In Washington State, the plants here from local activists and workers themselves do remain a majority dependent on majority Latinx and refugee workers, which is a very different sort of, very different shapes the organizing potentialities and the kinds of I would say pointed activity, you know, the kinds of organizing that might happen. But I think that's one sort of important piece of the work that I'm trying to do is to recenter Black workers in the South and their prominence and role in the entire meat industry, historically and to the present. I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but you know, if we also think about the mobilizations, the continued mobilizations of ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement throughout the pandemic, I do think, you know, I just through, you know, conversations, not any sustained study, right, that the threat is always productive of a particular kind of workforce. And it really hampers and shapes the ways that people are able to organize or even imagine they're organizing. But here, again, in Washington State, movements around abolition of the prisons through Free Them All Washington and abolitionist public health are working across folks who are directly impacted by the forms of immigration control through the Northwest Detention Center and all the people and communities connected to incarcerated people within the prison system. So I think there are really, really important coalitions, again, emerging around both of those forms of criminality.
Thanks. Soraya, I see your hand up. And I can't always see everyone's hand up because I don't have the full screen view. So get my attention in all sorts of ways or just unmute yourself. But Soraya, go ahead.
Yeah, so I also found this piece very impressive because, you know, especially how you trace, I'm a historian, right? So how you trace actually how the cotton really moved into this chicken business, right? And so that there is really a historical link, right? How this happened. And so I thought this was really very strong. But now I wonder how this translates because this meat production facilities and the COVID outbreaks have been an issue not just in this country, right, but also in other countries, and especially in Germany. Do you know the German case? It was a dramatic case. I was just reading up about this. It's in Gütersloh. It happened in July. So there was a huge, you know, Germany generally had been doing well, generally with the whole COVID story. But here there was a huge outbreak in one of these meat packing plants. I think there were 1,700 cases. I don't know. It was a very bad case. And then they isolated the whole city, you know, so there was a lot of resentment. And so, of course, they have been starting looking closer into this packaging stuff. As you can imagine, there were European immigrants working there. So Bulgarian, Polish people. You know, these are different. So they're not, they have rights. Here they can see also they protest, right? We are European citizens, we should have the same rights, right? But they were put under lockdown. Many of them didn't speak German, so they didn't understand what was really going on. And they were looking in the work conditions of this factory and the cramped living quarters, and especially also the ventilation in the firm. That in the end, they said it was all about the ventilation. But anyway, what I wonder, so, you know, in a way, it's very similar. It's a meat packaging thing, bad working conditions, a particular way of workforce, even if quite different than here, right? Actually with full rights, but still immigrants. And so, you know, they don't need visa or so to work in the European Union, right? They can just work. But so how does it translate, right? Or how have we to imagine, or is it, how can we make it the same story, right? I mean, I think you can, but not quite directly, right? Yeah, so I don't know if you have some thoughts about this, how to think these things together, because in a way it's good to make it very specific as you do, but then in a way there is also a broader context, right? Of capital production, I don't know what, right? That's at work here, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's That's a really good question. I haven't followed what's happening in Germany, but I will look at it now, and I hope you can share more if you'd like. I guess I would think about their connections. I mean, we could think about site-specific connections or conditions of work as connected, right, in the demands of productivity and line speeds. And I think the U.S. uses actually some German plants and Chinese plants as a sort of goal or model of to defend line speed, the sort of line speed regulations or lack of regulations that the USDA is currently pushing for. So I think there are obviously global connections in this idea or drive for constantly increasing productivity. And I think also of Tony Weiss's work on sort of the growing industrialization of meat production, and I guess the connectivity across borders in just taking the US model of in the ways that we consume meat to a global level. I wish I knew more about the intricacies of German production and that history, and would like to make more explicit connections there, but I don't feel like I can. But I think within the side of the workplace itself, right, there are conditions of work that make the spread of COVID-19 very, it's this very ripe conditions, right? The close proximity of the workforce, the speed and pace of work also shape how close workers must be to one another. The kinds of like protective measures that the CDC recommends and the WHO recommend are not necessarily accessible within these places because of the rate and pace of production. And the kinds of chemical hazards or chemical uses within the production line itself are all, most of them are conducive to respiratory illness and failure, which makes a person more susceptible to contracting COVID-19. So I think there are a number of conditions that are probably shared across these industries, although I don't know the specificity, right? And I think that for at least in the US and the outbreaks within plants too, you know, we can also, so I'm not sure about the German case, but in the South, leadership and their response to COVID-19 or lack of response really allowed sort of the circulation in and out of those plants, and lack of testing, lack of even basic measures like mask requirements. So I think the comparison would be important, but I'm curious, like what was the response for labor unions within Germany to the outbreak? How are they able to mobilize or not to pass any sort of protective legislation or measures? What kinds of access do workers have to like paid sick days and paid time off, and how might that compare and contrast to the US cases? But I think it's a really good point to think about what are the global connections here, and how can we, I think maybe another question within that question is, how does racial capitalism shape global production of meat? And that's something I need to think about a bit more, and hopefully others can help me.
Thank you.
Can I jump in?
So yeah, Fan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing piece, so timely and kind of along the lines of global connections. I was really interested in the multiple parallels between your piece and what I have been doing some research about, which is the factory workers in China producing for the global digital economy. So I was really curious when you mentioned the Chinese plants being models for some of the American plants. So maybe you could elaborate more on that. But another thing I was kind of thinking, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I was thinking under COVID, I mean, two of the most important things in our lives appear to be food and media. And so perhaps there's a way to draw those connections in terms of worker conditions and the possibility of storytelling, like what you're doing to make those experiences visible. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about what you think on this question. But I mentioned China and Germany as the USDA. I'm not sure if y'all are following or have heard of this, but there have been multiple attempts to increase line speeds over the past over a decade. But the most sort of concentrated effort happened in 2014 with an attempt to modernize poultry production. And so the writers of that proposal, which was really supported by Georgia politicians within Georgia, to the USDA cited line speed. There are the lack of line speed regulations within Germany and China, or the like high caps of line speed. So line speeds are measured by the number of birds that can be slaughtered per minute. Currently, it's at 140 birds per minute. Their push is for 175, or to remove that cap. And so far, despite the pandemic and despite the kinds of outbreaks that are happening, 20 plants across the U.S. have been provided waivers to operate at that line speed. So I think there's this. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, kind of the death dealing that occurs at the level of the USDA and the administration here. And your question about, so it's very, very maybe too overly simplistic connection to Chinese agriculture, and particularly animal agriculture. Mindy Schneider, I don't know if any of y'all are aware of her work, but she does some really great research on pork production in China, and makes some, I think, more important claims in terms of the sort of global connections of meat production. But in your question about food and media, I mean, I think that's such a brilliant, it's such an important question in thinking about the term or use of essential workers, and movements to really, at the same time of sort of the Department of Homeland Security saying that these workers who are considered or deemed essential are so important to our functioning, but then also that they are the ones that should be put at risk because they should be enabled to work, right, not from home, and they cannot work from home, and there are no protections to allow them to work from home, or no protections to really think about their any sort of alternatives to work in this time, so that people have to choose between a paycheck and possibly contracting COVID and spreading it to their family members and loved ones. So I think if folks who are theorizing social reproduction and the role of food to social reproduction might be an important end to the kinds of questions you're asking, or at least that's the line that I'm thinking around. And I think, I'm not sure, within the US, current movements for abolition, and particularly Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work, are really thinking about the role of food and agribusiness as part and parcel to those movements, right? The need to transform the way that we eat in order to really, really contest or combat the kinds of world making that racial capitalism produces. I don't know if y'all, I'm sure y'all folks in this group have read Rob Wallace's work, but I think he's been extremely influential on my thinking in really like the need to transform the big farm, right, on a global scale. And what that might look like through the kinds of stories that maybe you're proposing. I think that's what moves and shakes folks, right? There are people who are thinking about climate change activism through maybe connected to the kinds of stories you're talking about, and really the deeper oral histories that that Rachel's work engages, that my work tries to engage, might be one way to like retell and rethink alternatives to this terrible system of agribusiness that we so depend upon. One more loose connection, I think, I'm not sure if anyone's read, Alice Walker has this beautiful book about chickens. And I have the title, I'm like blanking on the whole title right now. But she writes about the Chicken Chronicles. So she writes about her relationship to chickens. and to raising these chickens. And she talks about this like longer sort of these memories of her relationship and her family's relationship to backyard chickens, right? And many of the women I talked to and interviewed had grandmothers, great-grandmothers who raised backyard chickens. Many women were the descendants of sharecroppers, like within 3 generations, right? And they talk about this relationship to the bird that is vastly different from the one that we have and rely upon today, right? And so maybe that's another way to think about storytelling and the transformation of food very explicitly within chicken. I'd love to hear how you're doing that in tech as well.
Yeah, super interesting. And Fawn, maybe later we can hear about, because I know these electronics assembly lines, they don't really, at least you don't hear the reports of outbreaks of COVID happening in them. And maybe it's because it's already kind of a clean room aesthetic in there. But we've got 3 questions stacking up. So we've got Elaine, Shelby, and then Zia on the queue.
Hi, Carrie. Thank you so much. This was a really great essay to read. I'm really curious and would love to hear you talk a little bit more about, what you call these contested visions of time. So I'm really, interested in this acceleration of line speeds in rice agriculture. It doesn't so much happen through mechanization, but rather through selective breeding, and then now with genetic engineering. So with rice, the acceleration is from 260 days to now the gold standard of 90 days, 110 days. But I guess my question is, if we're going to contest these mechanisms of control that E.P. Thompson thinks through, and how that happens through, kind of disciplining of a worker's time sense. So we're going to contest that. I'm wondering about the biology and ecology that happens as an effect of the acceleration. So I think a couple of weeks ago, Eben, you had Hannah Landecker. So Hannah Landecker thinks through antibiotics and the resistance that, then calls us to think about the biology of history. There's also, probably the work of Vanessa Agard-Jones, thinking about Martinique and banana plantations and this beetle, right? So this beetle is basically destroying these plantations. So you can think about those resistances that are coming from worker solidarity, but there are also resistances that are coming from, the more than human interactions that are, largely unintended. So I'm wondering about what happens in poultry farms. What do they do? There are diseases, there are pathogens, there are all sorts of things that happen because of this acceleration. Do you think about those as possible contestations of modernist time? Do you think about them as, shifting this accelerated, this prioritizing of faster speeds that's actually kind of, it's slowing things down, actually. At least in rice, it is. So I'm wondering, how this might work with poultry plants. Sorry, that was such a long question.
No, it's such a great question, and something actually I was hoping to get more insight from this group, because it's not something that I do. Like, I'm not a multi-species ethnographer. I would like to think more about the longer history of the transformation of the bird, but I've done that so far mostly through leaders of industry, right? So these big men who were able to transform and vertically integrate the industry quite rapidly, starting in the 1940s post-war period. And so these kinds of resistances from maybe the birds itself, or the conditions of growing out the bird is something I need to think about quite more. I'd love to think about more. In the footnote in the article, I cite Bryant Simon's work, who demonstrates sort of the transformation and the doubling in size and the rapid increase of the bird. And when I'm teaching when I'm teaching about this industry to my students in a food and ag class, I show the image of the bird in 1924 and then 1968 and then today, and they're just amazed, right? And I think maybe one way to respond or think about your question in an exploratory way is on the line. Actually, through the work, I thought about this question a lot because women are still required to work. They still need human labor because of the different sizes of the birds, the sort of even though they've sort of fine-grained feed and growing out time and all these things, they can't completely control the product, the animal. And so human labor is still so required. And there are attempts to really to completely mechanize the process, but these plants still hire thousands of workers, right, to produce millions of birds every week. And one moment, I want to share this with y'all especially and see what your thoughts, but there are moments when the birds like hop off the line. I mean, they've been slaughtered, they're defeathered, all these things, but they act in unruly ways that shape production, that slow down the line, that cause inspectors to stop the line, that cause workers all sorts of like injuries and things like that, right? So thinking about this interface at the point of production is really interesting to me, and I'd love to hear more about like what y'all are thinking, or if you're thinking along these lines, because it's not something I haven't necessarily had time to do yet.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, Frederic, who just joined from Paris, might have something to say on that. Frederic, do you have any sense of like these histories of the bird and how it became industrialized, or things that we should be reading?
I'm thinking of a book entitled Chickenizing. That I could give you the references, but it's a history of the poultry industry as it became globalized.
I think I just found it. John Hopkins, Chickenizing Farms and Foods. I'll share it. So we've got questions from Shelby and Zia in the queue.
Hi, Carrie. Hope you're doing well. And it was great to reread this article. I was thinking about, well, two things. At the beginning of, like, right after Trump had used the Defense Production Act to greenlight the reopening of these factories, I was having a conversation with Alex Blanchett and Jan Detkovich about like the idea that meat in and of itself is in no way essential, like even biologically is not something that's essential. And so to see at the same time that China is shuttering like $1 billion industry in live markets and this kind of really racialized discourse around it, that in the South, these people are being called back to the line as essential workers, which you touch on at the beginning. And I was just interested to know kind of how the workers themselves responded to that, of being labeled as essential when their work is kind of invisibilized and their injuries and their, health is put on the line, and how you experienced that, I guess, from afar in Washington when all of that was unfolding.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby, for that question. Good to see you. And I hope people look into Shelby and her work too in the future, maybe future iterations of this. Yeah, so when in late March, when all this news sort of hit my radar, I started reaching out to some workers that I still remain in contact with down in Georgia. And the response was really, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be risking our lives. I think it's captured in that the walkouts that happened across South Georgia, but also, there's this feeling of, and this is a response that I think I saw throughout my time there, is that there's a very clear understanding of what's just and what's unjust. but there are very few mechanisms for workers to have any power to respond to injustices, right? So there, as y'all know, there are very few, there's no national paid sick time, and so it's left to private industries on whether or not they want to provide any sort of leave for workers, and that was not, that doesn't take place in these plants, right? People don't get paid sick time. The disciplining that happens at these places, right? You can only really miss 7 days of work, or at least when I was there, you could only miss 7 days of work before you were fired immediately, no questions asked. So I think the response has always been one of, this is an individual I have to respond individually, right? I have to make the decision to care for my family, to care for my kids, or my grandkids, or continue getting paid. There's no safety net. And this is, I think, the work of this organized abandonment and the anti-state state, right? What really has happened in these workers' lives outside of their paid work, in so many ways shapes and motivates their decisions on the line, right? And this is tied to housing, this is tied to child welfare, this is tied to criminality and the forms of policing that happen. I mean, it's so interconnected beyond the point of production that it's really hard for workers to, it's really hard to see a way to fight outside of the union. And unions have mobilized, right? The UFCW, the RW, DSU. There have been several important actions and legislation attempted to be passed to support these workers, but our country we don't value essential workers, essentially, right? And to change that, I think, this is why environmentalists have to be abolitionists, I think, and vice versa.
Thank you. Zia.
So yes, thank you very much for the article. It sent off loads of really brilliant fireworks, loads of different ideas that kind of sparked. And one thing that I found particularly both kind of fascinating and emotive was this notion of your discussion of premature disability and the ways in which the factory kind of extracts excessive labor from the body to the point in which it's disabling. And there was something that was coming up for me around this question of optimization and always wanting to speed up the factory line, and then these discussions of different times and when workers are being observed. And I was making this I was kind of interested in that connection between the kind of racialized sense of blackness is in some way inherently lazy, and the ways in which blackness has historically, you kind of mentioned that this history of capitalism always being racial capitalism from the 16th century onwards. And then I'm kind of interested in Linnaeus dividing human civilization into races, and then one of the traits he gives to Black people being laxus, kind of laziness. And so the kind of beginnings of capitalism and this racial capitalism of extraction and greater extraction of kind of human husbandry, and often Black bodies at the center of this question, but then Black bodies often framed as somehow inherently lazy in kind of dominant discourse, and that there's this question of the supervisor walking along the line and making sure that workers are ever increasing productivity. And I wondered, I was just kind of interested in whether you could elucidate some of those kind of questions around premature disability and kind of the racial figurings of good workers. I think there's a kind of counterpoint you draw out in relation to migrant workers being framed as more industrious in a way, and I wondered if those kinds of cultural perceptions of race and work, if you could kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I tried to do it in a few ways in the article, but really I'll start with the specific of the history of the industry, and then try to kind of scale up to the Black radical tradition. But I think within the industry, and I talked about this a little bit, there's been demographic shifts, major demographic shifts within the industry. And historically in the US in 1940s, when it took off and processing moved within these concentrated plants, most of the workers were white women, white rural women, working class women. And during World War II, with the kinds of demands around war production and other sorts of industries really taking off, many of the white women left the plant. I mean, it's even in rural places of the South, and were replaced by majority Black workers. Initially, though, Black workers would be hired in some parts of the South as in what they called Black jobs, so the worst, the shittiest jobs in evisceration, which is like the actual like pulling of the guts, or in slaughter, the first like cuts, live hang, sorry, I couldn't think of the term. And so this transformation to a majority Black workforce first started in that period, and really through the Civil Rights Act was completely transformed to almost entirely Black in most places. And then in the 90s, so there's a long history of labor organizing that took place starting in the Civil Rights Movement up until the late 80s across the South, when many of the unions started major campaigns in the US South. There was a Operation Dixie that really focused on poultry processing and catfish workers. And these are more majority Black women industries. And so this is when the major employers started to look for different workers, and the story of recruitment of undocumented workers really took off in these different places. So we see a transformation. But throughout that, we see the sort of racial, the categorization of workers change, right? When white workers were majority in the plant, employers, there are interviews that I have with employers during the 50s and 60s that were like, oh, we really want Black women because white workers are lazy and Black women are so industrious and work hard and all these things. And then you see that shift again with in the 1990s as a response and an attempt to disorganize labor. But to scale up and this sort of anti-Blackness as a world-making activity, I don't know if that's exactly what you were talking about, but I think globally, right, we can, historically, we can think about the general strike and the attempt to, so I'm rethinking this logic of laziness and racialization, but the general strike for the Civil War as an attempt to fight not only to reconsider, restructure the conditions of work. So it's the movement for freedom and emancipation was also simultaneously a movement for a transformation of how value is extracted. and so I think this is why this logic sort of emerges as forever lazy, is racialized and coded as Black, because there's a real, at least in the Black radical tradition, a resistance to the production of value for a white supremacist society, right? And so this is why, I mentioned Du Bois's work and Souls, but I think that's really informative to how I'm thinking about these conversations around value, worth, and race. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got questions from Melanie and Elizabeth, and I've also got another question too.
Cool. Thank you so much. It's such a great read and a great discussion as well. I mean, partly I'm just following up on the kind of the multi-species aspects of the chicken, and I wonder what archives do the chicken take you to, from like the chicken itself as an archive, as the chicken's body as an archive, but then also the embodied archive. And I think that comes through very strongly in your article, that what the labor does to the body, but then also, of course, there's the eating of the chicken and the interactions, the biological interactions with the chicken. And then I would be curious to learn a little bit more about the oral history interviews you did, and like how strongly, I don't know, I mean, like things like connections between like this trajectory from the cotton to the chicken come through there, so the kind of archive that opens up there, but then maybe also archives that are further removed, like stories about, I don't know, stories about chicken, folktale about chicken. The chicken just seems such a powerful storytelling figure. And I also just don't know if this will work on the camera. I want to show you this. It's a cloth that I recently found on one of my like visits to the cloth market here, and it's supposed to be a story about gender, and according to the manufacturer, but it's a cloth that lends itself to so much storytelling about a whole range of other things. So if you're keen to have a piece of the cloth, I'm happy to cut some off and post it to you.
That's so kind. Thank you. I mean, this question is one that I think this group is pushing me to think about. The archive of the chicken itself, not only tied to or shaped by industrial forms of production that we see. That's not something I've had the time to do, but it is something I'm interested in doing. I mentioned Psyche Williams-Forson's book, so building houses out of chicken legs. And, you know, she has her opening chapter is looking at the historical connections of Black women in the United States to chicken. And her archive is really interesting, right? Because she has to rely on travelers' logs, mostly plantation owners' sort of memoirs and diaries, and court proceedings. So I think this goes back to Zia's question. So a lot of her archival material is looking at the criminalization of Black people for their relationship with the bird, stealing the birds, hiding birds, secretly sort of growing out birds, right? And so I think that this archive, the archive that she's pieced together is really brilliant. And if you are interested, I'd suggest her work. But in the archive that I worked mostly with was through the University of Georgia. They have, because many of the founders of the industry were tied to cooperative extension and some of the work of ag extension within UGA, they have a really good archive of D.W. Brooks, who was one of the leaders within the cotton cooperative that was then transformed to Gold Kiss and used for poultry production. And so I rely on that archive to think about the industry's relationship to the bird historically. But I'd love and welcome if y'all have suggestions for other types of archives. And as far as the oral histories, so I interviewed around, let's see the exact number, I think the 64 women who were tied to the plant in some way. Most of the women that I met actually and interviewed, I interviewed months after I stopped working at the plant. Some of those women were women that I met through the work at the plant, but many of them were just snowball sampled, right? And the intergenerational interviews and oral histories were not necessarily what I set out to do, but it's sort of something I luckily stumbled upon. And I think it also speaks to kind of the ways in which entire families see their relationship to the industry, right? But women would refer to their families as poultry families. Because there would be, you know, the great-grandmother, grandmother, and daughter now, or a mother worked at the plant, and they hope that their great-great-granddaughter never has to set foot in that plant or near that plant, right? But those opportunities to do otherwise are rarely available, and so I think that what was really telling about the intergenerational interviews oral histories and why they were so important is that, you know, they spoke to a different kind and relationship and support that the plant provided in lieu of other social supports outside the plant that the older generation may have had. And there were women who worked in the plant for upwards of, you know, 30, 40 years. But the younger generation that was in their 20s when I was doing field work in 2014 to 16, would use the plant as sort of a patchwork of jobs. So the plant would be one job for a while until it completely broke down their bodies or they were too tired, and then they would shift to fast food work, which was an option, but it paid so poorly. So there was sort of a circulatory geography in which the plant became one site of many sites, right? And I think this speaks to the degradation of work more generally. But I don't know, I'll stop there and just for other questions.
Thanks, Carrie. And we're officially past the usual hour time slot, but Carrie, if you've still got time, there's a bunch of people who still have questions, so I'm happy to stay on as long as you have time. Is it okay to keep going for you?
Yeah, I think I can stay on maybe 20 more minutes.
Oh, great. I'm sure we can wrap up by then. So Elizabeth, you've got the next one.
Thanks. Actually, the note you just ended on, Carrie, is kind of a good segue. Well, first, just thanks for this text and for your work generally. I know there's at least one online webinar that you've helped facilitate since COVID struck that's kind of helped me think through the current moment with prisons and pandemics. So just, yeah, thanks for, your persistence in that. I've also been doing field work related to prisons and abolition here in California, and been writing something lately, like thinking through the current moment through the lens of a community-based organization that runs prison gardens here. That's been, kind of the whole programming system has kind of broken down lately. But I wanted to bring my question to like one part of the text, where you're talking about premature death due to COVID and incarceration and the sort of failure of state governors and departments of correction to like grant clemency and early releases. And you have then this quote of, if the work of abolition is not only about stopping prisons, but also about imagining a future in which we win, then people cannot be released from prisons only to be put on the streets or to premature disability at the Poultry. And it had me thinking about, release process here in California, where like before COVID, there was this antiquated system of just getting like $200 gate money, which is a number set in the 1970s. And then suddenly when people were very validly demanding like early releases, for the first time, the Department of Corrections was like, oh, but where will people go? There's no housing available. It's really bad for public health to just release people when there's no housing. So now there's suddenly like near universal like housing access for everyone who's released from prison. And there's also, rides that are transportation that's been set up with the help of these community-based organizations. So I guess, yeah, bringing this back to the context you've been working in, one question could be like, are there examples you've seen to build alternative economies, perhaps, where people don't have to be released from prison and work in the Poultry, or modes of valorizing other forms of labor that keep people out of this kind of circuit that you just mentioned of going from the Poultry to fast food industries, or or anything like that you've kind of seen, the work of abolition in action, such that people perhaps are becoming less reliant on the Poultry, at least on that local scale. And thanks again.
Thanks for your question. I'd love to hear more about the work that you mentioned with, the gardens happening within the prisons are one thing, but I think that one really direct thing that I think there are models across the country, but I recently met a woman, Abby Henderson, who started this group, Gangstas and Growers in Atlanta, that works with juvenile, like kids who are recently in juvie, to grow food at a rate of $15 an hour, which is double the minimum wage in the state of Georgia. And, she, in an interview, she shares some of her work and like the motivation behind it. But it's really, there's this beautiful drive. And she says that I think to love Black people. and to take care of people, to allow them to really remain in place. And I think that's what prisons do by extracting people from the places they're from, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, and as you probably have experienced, driving people to and from the prisons to the places where they come from. But you know, thinking about the real sort of forms of restorative justice that have to happen in place of the kinds of work release programs that currently exist, right? So, I mean, these work release programs just seem so criminal to, I don't know, to use their language, right? In that there are these direct contracts with the Department of Corrections to pay people really low minimum wage, usually, or less, when they're so close to being released. And with all the movements to push for early release right now that are happening across the nation, and Free Them All campaigns, even these people are not being released, right? That it's really mind-blowing. But I think, you know, the many movements for Black land across the South, and those are historically rooted in all sorts of Black agrarianism and Black nationalist movements, to things like Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, that are really centering alternatives to the sort of racial capitalism that exists, right? By creating worker-owned cooperatives, by creating worker-owned farms. And I think if you speak to any of the activists who are engaged in this work, I'm thinking of some Friends of Friends in Mississippi that run TKO farms, and they just had a fundraiser drive to buy back parcels of land, right? We can directly connect the lack of opportunities and alternatives to the theft of and dispossession of land that is ongoing. And racialized, right? And so if we repair those things, then we might get ourselves all closer to the visions of abolition that I think, Elizabeth, you and probably many of the folks you are working with are fighting for. I think that's such a great question, because this is the one that that activists and abolitionists in particular are grappling with, right? Like, where do people sleep when they are released? Like, it's not just enough, obviously, to release the population by half, but then it demands that we all ask these questions about what kind of state we provide for folks. Is that a people-centered state? Is it the forms of mutual aid and that are emerging outside of the state? I think those are all sort of questions we have to grapple with as scholar activists and folks fighting for a different world.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Frederic, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, very briefly. I was interested by the connection you made between general strike and poultry production from the perspective of workers, because I also made this connection, but rather from the perspective of experts who detect poultry diseases. And it's a connection that I made in my first book on avian influenza, particularly stressing the fact that in Hong Kong, when the government was preparing for influenza pandemics coming from birds, they kept repeating that it would be the first pandemic since 1968. And 1968 was a year when there was a massive strike in Hong Kong and a fear that it would cause the collapse of the British colony. So I made this connection with the idea that you can prepare for strike as you prepare for pandemics. And so it's the idea of a general strike as the suspension of activity, both human and non-human. So I wonder if you have thought about that.
Yeah, I think the non-human question is really important. I'm curious. So your question is that they frame the pandemic to that revolt, to that movement. So the pandemic in the present COVID-19 to this moment of strike that you're talking about? Is that your?
Well, there was the narrative that a pandemic would act as a general strike because it basically would block the activity, as happened during the SARS crisis, 2003.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I think that's an important question, and something I wish I had something better to say. I mean, I'm thinking that was the assumption of what would happen, or that there was a class assumption that would be enabled through COVID-19 and people's ability to stay at home and stay healthy, right, with all these sort of state, city, local acts. But not to be too pessimistic, but the anti-state state, I guess, has always found a way to resist that the work stoppage that you're talking about, I think, here. And for particular segments of the society. But, you know, it does also make me think of the fear around and motivation for the Defense Production Act and that executive order was that they were going to have to cull all of millions and millions of animals, right? So I think there is maybe a connection there that other folks in here could share a little bit more on. But I think, I'm not sure if it's directly related, but, you know, when Hurricane Florence swept the South, there are all these images of the fecal soup of hog processing, pigs swimming through the water, and hundreds of thousands of chickens that had died because of the devastation of that hurricane. So I'm thinking maybe there's some potentiality or possibility to think about climate change and the kinds of animal acts that you're maybe talking about in general strike terms. I don't know. I like this question. But I'm not sure if I have anything too clear to say on it yet. Yeah.
I just have one final question, just back to what you were talking about when Soraya was asking about the meat plant outbreaks in Germany, and I posted something about another meat plant in Australia. I'm just super curious about what is it about these factory models that travel? You know, are there people, are there international consulting firms? Because it looks like it's not the same companies. So have you written on this, or do you know of anyone else, or where is there like a conference that one can go to learn about how these travel, like an industry sponsored set of events? I'm a curious ethnographer thinking of following in your footsteps here.
Yeah, I think that would be really important work to go to these like National Chicken Council conventions or NAMI conventions, American Meat Institute.
NAMI, you said?
There's also, so that was part of my research plan, but I didn't get to that. But Philip Howard, I think, does a lot of really beautiful sort of global corporation tracing and networking mapping that he does, that thinks about the global links of, say, firms like JBS, which is a Brazilian-owned company, but owns several plants within the US, poultry production plants. As many of you know, Smithfield is now owned by sort of a private-public partnership in China, and Mindy Schneider's work touches on that purchase. Yeah, so I think that would be a really brilliant ethnography. I do know that some of the chicken conferences that were taking place near my field site at the University of Georgia had several delegates from Brazil, from Argentina, from other places in Latin America, and I know that there are strong sort of relationships across that university and universities within Brazil. But yeah, I would love to see someone do that work. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, this has been a super generative discussion today. It's a fascinating piece, and I think we were talking about these things early in the pandemic, but didn't quite have the language or the empirical stuff to work through it. So your piece is really I want to say wonderful, but it's also horrific, you know, and I think it's kind of the sharpness of the analysis and the richness of the empirical detail that makes the work so great. So can't wait to see more articles and the book. And thanks for coming this week, and hope to see you back in future meetings.
Thanks so much for letting me share the space with y'all, and I can't wait to learn more about the work taking place here and getting to know you each a bit more. So yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie.
Bye, everyone. Good to see you.